Okay, well, so welcome to the fourth lecture of European integration. The topic today is labor mobility and its role in the economic process, the economic integration process. So today we're going to review, as always, the last lecture. I'll talk about labor mobility as an important driver of the European integration process, but in general, theoretically, as a driver of of economic integration in general. To do that, we'll go back to our Edgeworth box framework and take a look at that and show how migration actually can be a substitute for capital mobility. It's a very important point. This is not just a vague theoretical point. It can be seen in many of the development episodes between East and Western Europe, or even Eastern and Western Germany. Okay, so we'll talk about that in the later part of the lecture. We'll talk about the theory of migration in terms of the microeconomic aspects. And these microeconomic aspects are probably not known to you. That's why it's a good idea to take this course, and you probably won't see it in many other courses. So we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about migration as an investment. So when people move from Lampedusa, from Africa to Lampedusa, they're taking on incredibly high costs, paying very high human costs and certainly financial costs to get to Europe for uncertain benefits, but these benefits last a long time if they make it. So this is one way of thinking about the migration decision in general. When you move from A to B, you're actually taking a decision that involves upfront costs and a whole stream of benefits over the future. Sometimes they're known, sometimes they're uncertain. We'll talk about the visible aspects of migration, but also the invisible aspects. It turns out that migration is not a completely neutral process. The people who migrate tend to be different from those who don't migrate. And we've seen this historically, and there's a very nice theory that I'd like to introduce to you called the Roy theory of mobility, or the Roy theory of migration, which goes back to Roy's pioneering work in 1951. Has a very nice application of statistics to understand what kind of people actually migrate in the end. A lot of times we can't observe the attributes of the people, especially as econometricians. We may not be able to measure the motivation of a person or the person's sort of enthusiasm for his or her work, but we can certainly observe the type of people that leave and people that stay. And you can look at the earnings of those people. Okay, so this is something we'll spend some time talking about. This has effects on the sending region as well as the receiving region. So take the East German case. East Germany lost about 1 million workers between 1989 and 1995. Well, many of them went back, but this was a loss for Eastern Germany. A lot of talented human capital, a lot of young people who were highly motivated left the region, and that had a lasting effect on the region in the sense that they just weren't there anymore. And it also had a very positive effect on the West German regions. You can see this in the European context, Eastern European, Western European migration. You can see it in the United States. You see it in general across the world, global migration patterns. We'll spend a fair amount of the lecture talking about migration in practice, looking at some specific cases. We'll talk about the German case in detail. I'll give you some econometric estimates, the effects of unemployment and wages on migration. These are useful numbers to know. It turns out that migration has an asymmetric effect. So an increase in wages in the source region have a different effect on migration than a decrease in wages in the sending region. Okay, so the same is true of unemployment. Okay, so these are all sort of practical questions that we can talk about. We'll also talk about migration within the United States as a benchmark. So there is a lot of migration. Americans are very mobile. Europeans are much less so. So this is something to take into account. And we'll close by talking about some numbers and what to expect in the future. Okay, so last time we discussed capital mobility. Remember, we're talking about neoclassical economics, and we're talking about capital and labor entering the production function complementarily. So there's a capital argument in the production function. There's labor as an argument. And these can, in some sense, can be substitutes. We discussed capital mobility first, capital mobility between regions, beyond regions. We talked about the relative rate of return as a driver for capital mobility. We also talked about the role of the financial system, and we talked about some of the risks of capital mobility. These are outstanding questions that still arise in the discussion of having a unified capital market, or so-called capital market union, as a complement to the banking union. We'll discuss that more later on in the course. Today I'm going to talk about labor mobility. So labor mobility is a substitute for capital mobility. The idea being that people can move instead of the machines. And whether this is done, you know, you can incur one-off costs that can be paid by a society, by the receiving region, or by the sending region. So we have to look at the microeconomics. There are adjustment costs involved. So the neoclassical framework is a bit limited in its scope. We treat capital and labor as completely substitutable in terms of the region they're operating in, but in fact, there may be adjustment costs that are imposed. And this may be the case with migration more so than the case of capital mobility. Remember, in a world with constant returns, we don't really care where we are inside the Edgeworth box along the diagonal. In terms of welfare, in terms of productive capacity, it's the same. It doesn't matter. But in fact, the path that you take to get to that point along the diagonal may be absolutely crucial. So about half of this lecture is dedicated to discussing the costs of migration to the individual and the cost to society. Okay, so the receiving end of the migration may have to create all sorts of infrastructure to accommodate the new migrants. This is a very important discussion that we're having in parts of Europe today. Okay, so to start, we'll ignore those costs. We'll just talk about the fundamental incentive to migrate, just looking at relative wages in this framework, assuming a common technology. So it's probably a good way of thinking about this would be comparing, say, Poland and Finland, as we did before, or Germany and France. So we'll be looking really within EU migration, but everything we talk about can be adapted to an international context. We can talk about international migration under the same, with the same types of theoretical constructs. And we'll be appealing to neoclassical economic theory to gain these insights, okay, to discuss the effects of wages on migration, but also the effect of migration on wages. So we'll be using the same framework we've had before, okay? And this is important because economics is all about feedback effects. It's about people have an incentive to migrate, capital has an incentive to move across regional boundaries. This has an effect on the rates of return and the factor rewards for working. This feeds back into the incentive to migrate. So to do this properly, it's a general equilibrium approach, and it's always useful to think of it in those terms. So go back to our box again. The endowment point, E, is where Poland and the other country, which says UK, but it's supposed to be Finland, there it is, involves some sort of incentives for capital to move. We talked about that last time. And now we're going to talk about the alternative, which would be to move in a horizontal direction. It would be literally a translation of the point from E to the right of that, meaning that Poles move to Finland. Okay, so this has been observed. We observed mobility of Polish labor since the accession of Poland in 2004, even before. This will have effects that we can think about in the neoclassical framework. Now, what are the incentives for people to move? Well, they're quite large. So this is data right after accession. You can see that wages in Poland, and these are private sector earnings, so these are not including Social Security contributions, 16% of German levels. So a skilled worker in Poland could literally increase his or her salary by 600%, or 500 or 600% by moving to Germany on average. Clearly, if you're skilled, you could probably do even better. So there are huge incentives in 2005 to migrate. Okay, and of course, if you look further to the east, the incentives are even larger. I mean, Latvia, 7%, Bulgaria, 5%. So it's not surprising that young people who have a long horizon to amortize investments would be very interested in moving. Okay, so this is in 2005. I will show you an update in a few minutes, and you'll be able to see that things have indeed changed the way theory predicts. Okay, so I already mentioned this. Labor mobility is an investment because if labor decides to move, it usually has to pay some costs. We'll have to think about that very carefully. Economists talk about this as a human capital decision. So it's like when you train, you do university training, or you go do an apprenticeship in Germany, and you get skills, and you can go to the market and use them. Those skills allow you to earn more money. So you can think of it as an investment. You spend some time up front, 2 or 3 years in an apprenticeship, and you get higher earnings afterwards. Or you go to the university route, do your university studies, and after 7 years, you get your degree, and then you can get a much better job. And that's actually quite easy to show. Also have a lower expected unemployment rate, so it's an investment. So you can think of a migration decision as the same thing. You're paying sometimes extraordinary costs to cross the Mediterranean Sea, or to move from Germany to France, or France to Germany, for the prospect of some improvement of your human condition. Okay? In the first instance, we're just going to talk about a wage comparison. We're not going to talk about comparing all these other things, which are going to come up in a second. It's a very, very involved decision. But the simplest decision would be just a comparison of wages where you're working at home and where you're working abroad, possibly taking into account taxes. So maybe in Sweden, wages are high, but taxes are high too. So what's the point? On the other hand, maybe there's subsidies for people to migrate. So there are all sorts of other things that one has to add to the equation. We're just going to look at wages in the crudest possible sense. So in the neoclassical framework, the wage is equal to the marginal product of competitive firms in the labor market. We're eliminating monopsony. We're ignoring monopoly. We're ignoring all these market imperfections. We're just going to take the simple assumption that the wage is close to the marginal product of labor en place, where the labor is being used. Okay? So a French worker that migrates to Germany will get the marginal product of German workers in Germany. Again, we can adjust that, but there are simple explanations for those differences in productivity, which are the basis of the whole Edgeworth analysis. Okay, so we'll first ignore uncertainty. So basically, the worker, just going back to that table before, the worker compares, Bulgaria, I can get 5% I can earn 5% of what I could earn in Germany. It's a huge difference to migrate. Or the worker in Slovenia might be quite a more modest comparison, might be a third, still might be interesting, depending on the migration costs. In the simplest analysis, in the simplest Edgeworth analysis, it's simply comparison of those two marginal products. So we're going to be using neoclassical microeconomic theory to make a comparison of the marginal product of labor in the home region. We'll call that F sub L, which is the first derivative of the production function, holding capital constant. That's equal to the wage, W. The comparison is W star. What can I earn abroad? What can I earn in the other region? And we'll make the same assumption that in the other region, firms pay the marginal product of labor in their region, and that's equal to F star sub L, or the first derivative of the production function abroad with respect to L. Now, those production functions are the same, but they may have different capital stocks, and they may have different capital intensities, and therefore the marginal product of labor can be different, even if they have the same technology. And in this Edgeworth analysis, the only reason wages are different across the regions is capital intensity. As a first instance, we're going to, again, that's why I sort of harp on the Finnish-Polish example. Those two nations are pretty comparable, except for the fact that Poland has a much lower capital intensity than Finland has, because it's been sort of a free market economy for a long time. It's had a lot of access to foreign capital markets, and it's had a lot of given its citizens a large number of decades to save and accumulate capital, to the point where the capital is just as productive as it would be somewhere else in the market economy in the world. Okay, so again, on that basis, it's really easy to understand the effect of migration. So to do this, we're just going to assume that capital is constant. So I'm going to freeze capital capital mobility I talked about in the previous lecture, I'm going to set to 0, and I'm going to ask what happens if people move. Well, it turns out if people move, that changes the capital-labor ratio in both regions. So movement of one person from Poland to Finland will lower the capital-labor ratio in Poland. Movement of one person from Poland to Finland will reduce the capital-labor ratio in Finland and raise it in Poland. So it has a dual aspect. It's going to actually it's going to decrease capital intensity in the capital-rich country, in Finland, but it's also going to raise it in Poland. So the people who stay are actually going to benefit from the actions of those who leave. In any case, it's going to mean that these disparate capital-labor ratios that we assumed at the outset, going back to the picture, if you look at the picture again, point E shows a very, very high capital-labor ratio in Finland compared to Poland. That means that the wage in Finland is going to be higher than it is in Poland, and therefore there'll be an incentive to move. But once we move in this direction, in the east-west direction towards the east, the capital-labor ratio in Poland will start to rise, and that in Finland will fall. And that's exactly what the mechanism, the equilibrating mechanism does. Okay, so basically, to see that formally, you need to look at the marginal product of labor as in response to a change in the capital-labor ratio. Okay, so we have constant returns to scale as an assumption. Therefore, the marginal product of labor is going to depend only on the intensity with which capital is employed in that particular region. Okay, so F sub L is sufficiently described by the capital-labor ratio. We can see that formally by just taking the derivative of this intensive form production function. Remember, the intensive form production from the Solow model was equal to the capital F of K and L divided by L. L is employment. Okay, so if you do that, you can also think about payments to capital in an intensive notation sense. The payments of capital per capita are going to be equal to the rate of interest or the rate of return on capital times the capital intensity in that, the capital per capita, capital intensity. So that's the same thing as R times K, but R is equal to the marginal product of capital, so F sub K times K is the total payments to capital. Then the wage is the residual. In this world where there's just capital and labor being used, labor and capital exhaust national income. Therefore, Y minus K times F prime is exactly the payment to labor. So all we have to do is differentiate that with respect to little k to see what happens to the wage. Okay? Because that is the wage. Right? It's payment per worker in this setup. Okay? So take that derivative. Do that. Maybe do it in the section. If you take that derivative, there are 3 terms, and 2 of them cancel. And what's left is basically the second derivative of the production function, which is by assumption negative, because it's a concave intensive production function. So minus times a minus is a positive. So increasing the capital intensity, which is the outcome of investment given labor, would raise the wage. It would also raise the wage in Poland. And taking the negative of that effect would mean that the capital intensity of Finland will decline as a consequence of migration. And we're talking about a lot of people. In the case of Germany, we were talking like 500,000 per year, or for the first 2 years with some return migration. These are large effects. So you'd expect to see something in wages. And you could blame somebody, you can blame the unions, you can blame all sorts of other people, but in fact it's just a natural economic consequence that labor becomes in short supply and it becomes more plentiful elsewhere. Okay? So this is basically purely basic neoclassical economics applied in a very, very nice way to a simple regional context. And we'll try to develop that in more detail. In a second, I'll show you the data of what happens after 2005 between these border countries that are bordering Germany, that are obviously sending workers in increasing numbers, especially after 2008. And you can see what happens to wages in that way. So again, this is the math again for those who didn't catch it or otherwise busy right now. Basically, this is an adjustment mechanism, has the same type of effect. In fact, it's a substitute, as you can see, for capital mobility. Labor mobility has the same effect on capital, the capital intensity that investment would have, FDI would have, or even some accumulation of capital coming from a third region. It causes a convergence of the two capital-labor ratios in the two areas. Now, the important thing is that the path the economy actually takes and the approach that it takes towards the diagonal will depend on the microeconomics of the migration decision. Okay, so this is why we spend more than half of the lecture talking about the microeconomics of migration and not these macroeconomic aspects. But it should be clear to you, I said this already, the path of the adjustment matters. The path of the adjustment represents the cost that society has to pay. There's some adjustment costs with respect to capital, but probably the most important costs are the ones that are being paid by the migrants to move. That's the presumption we might want to make. So we have two vectors operating at the same time. We have the left to right movement implied by labor mobility, and we have the north to south movement, the arrow implied by capital mobility, and the sum of those two vectors is going to point us to some point on the diagonal. So you can imagine if and we do this in the master's course a bit more intensely, we do it in more detail, you can think of those adjustment costs as having an effect on the size of those vectors. So if people are really, really interested in leaving and it's easy to move, the Poles have no impediments to come to Finland, then that east-west vector will be much larger, and we'll end up landing at a point somewhere immediately to the east of E, or as the case would be, Poland would in effect shrink. Poland would lose a lot of population. Or if capital is very mobile, we'd have a north-south movement, and Poland would pretty much stay the same in terms of population, in terms of workers, but it would have a much better capital endowment. Okay, so those are two possible substitutes for each other, and as I said before, really assessing that will be difficult. We need to study the microeconomics of migration to get a better view as to what those costs are. Okay, so that's a summary, basically. This is a static view, and you'll see that in the end, this may not be a point of indifference. Okay, and just to give you an example, if you travel through eastern Germany now with a car, you will often go through large patches of land where there are no people. There are villages that are totally depopulated. This is a consequence of exactly this process. You can actually go through the Mazuren in Poland, and you can find similar situations. They're like national parks. We've seen something like the evolution of population, depopulated regions. This is because of economics. People have left because there's nothing to do there. Obviously, if there's no capital, if capital doesn't come to these regions, then people will leave. Okay, so this kind of gives you an idea why the many East Germans were chanting back in 1989, if the D-Mark doesn't come to East Germany or to the DDR, we're going to go to the Mark. We're going to move to the West. Okay, so let's spend some time talking about the microeconomics of migration. I already mentioned we're talking about an investment decision. This is fundamental economics. Investment means you pay now and you get returns in the future. Those returns may be for sure. They may also be uncertain. There may be a mixture. There may be regime changes. There's maybe fundamental risk. All those things are important. Migration is a human capital decision because the person who takes the migration decision actually does it to have an influence on the path of earnings in the future. Okay, so there is it involves an increase in your earnings potential over your lifetime. And that's why migration is considered a human capital decision, just as if you were going to do a training program or get a university education. So to do that, you need to think hard about the costs and the benefits of this decision. When I say costs, I mean not just monetary outlays, I mean also other emotional costs you might have to take. Okay, so if you leave your home, you leave your family, you leave your favorite soccer team, you're incurring some costs. These costs may be one-off, you know, break the links and it's all over, or it may take several years before you get over your decision. A lot of people don't have language skills when they migrate to different parts of the world, and they have to bear quite high costs. Often these costs can be mitigated by finding local communities where it's less strenuous to exist and to get by, but in the end there are some costs involved. So these costs and benefits have to be compared. They involve expectations, they also involve discounting, and therefore we can use all these tools we've learned in economics to make comparisons of shifts in parameters. What would happen if a person is more risk averse? What would be the consequence if a person used a higher discount rate to discount those future earnings? Or what would happen if the earnings were converging as we had already discussed? Remember, the prediction of the Edgeworth box is that mobility will cause the wage differential to decline over time. As capital gets accumulated in Poland, the Polish start to earn more money, migration looks less attractive. Okay, and that puts a damper on migration. So it would be naive and it would be stupid to assume that the migration incentive would be permanent. It'd be silly to assume that the difference between Polish and German wages is going to last forever. And if you don't think it's going to last forever, maybe you'd prefer to stay home because there are a lot of fixed costs involved. So all these things can be used in the comparative statics framework. We can ask, and it's a nice exam question, I can ask you what happens if the people over in the sending region have an increase in their discount rate for whatever reason, or the costs of migrating have increased, or their risk aversion has changed. We'll talk about all these things in sequence. So this is a diagram you'll certainly have to do on the exam. You'll have to learn how to manipulate this exam. This diagram, this is basically a valuation problem. Every investment decision that a business makes can be written in some sense like this. If it involves a permanent discounted value of gains from taking the decision and a comparison with fixed outlays today, okay, then you can basically plot the value of that investment decision for various values of the benefit. Okay, so the implicit assumption here is that the benefit is constant. And we'll get rid of that assumption, but just to get started. So WF minus WH is the wage differential. I'm at home, that's H, and F is abroad, and WF minus WH is the difference. So if I can earn 15 euros an hour in Germany, and I'm earning 5 euros an hour in Poland, 10 would be the number. And under the assumption that 10 lasts forever, that would be the permanent difference. Okay, but maybe it's not going to last forever. Maybe it's going to die away. It's going to disappear. Okay, so let's just assume first that it's going to last forever. And suppose you have to pay F to do the migration. So you got to get a truck, put your stuff in the truck. Your family has to be taken out of school. Maybe you don't have a family. These can all be different. You've got to break your links with your neighborhood, with your Fußballverein, all these other things you have to do before you leave, and that's going to go into F. So no matter, clearly at the very, very low differentials, it's not going to be worth going, basically. That's one way of thinking about it, because you've got to pay this F regardless. Okay, so that's basically where you'd be for a small wage differential, to the left of the point where it says decision threshold. Okay, at some point you break even. The discounted gains are just equal to the initial outlay, and that would be the point where the arrow is pointing. At that point, the discounted value, and note that I've discounted in the formula in a very general way. The summation could be infinite. You could be migrating for your dynasty, or it could be over a fixed time interval. Then you have to use some sort of formula. The idea is 1 plus R. Inverse is the discount factor, or I divide by 1 plus R when I'm getting something tomorrow. And I'm getting something in T periods, I divide by 1 plus R to the Tth power. simple discounting. So these workers are, facing perfect certainty. There's no risk involved, and they discount by R, which is the rate of interest. So if the rate of interest is low, like it is today, maybe 1 or 2%, this is going to be a fairly large weight on future income. So that's going to make it very interesting to migrate under given conditions. So if you look at this gray line, the gray line implies a negative value in investment below the threshold, so you just won't do it. Right? You only migrate in this situation if the wage differential lies above that point where the arrow is pointing. Okay? So we can basically draw the value of the migration investment to an individual is that. Okay? So it's only really going to have positive value if the migration, if the wage differential exceeds the threshold. Otherwise, you don't do it. Okay? So one interpretation of those people in Poland who have not migrated yet, even though wages are significantly, even today, significantly higher in Germany, or those people who have not migrated to Finland, is because their costs are very high, and maybe for them this wage differential is just not sufficient. It's one way of thinking about it. Okay, but that clearly can't be the whole story, because these are very large differentials we observe in Europe, the ones we observed in 2005. I'll show you the most recent numbers in a second. Okay, so we can modify this theory. So a good answer on the exam will have to show me more stuff than this. Okay, because implicit in this is only the fixed cost, the time horizon T, and the discount rate, and the wage differential, obviously. And that's a variable that's moving across the horizontal axis. Okay, so the first thing we could do is assume risk aversion. So people are scared. People are scared. They got a certain wage in Poland, and if they go to Finland, they may get lucky and get a good job that pays the Finnish wage, but they may get discriminated against. They may get a lower wage. That happens. That happens in this country. It happens everywhere. And if that's the case, there's risk involved, and if there's risk involved, you won't discount by the discount rate R, and you won't use the factor 1 divided by 1 plus R as a discount factor. You use something called beta, which is some sort of risk-adjusted discount factor, implying a higher discount rate. Okay? Okay, so again, if you do finance, if you're a business student, you know that you discount risky projects by higher discount rates to get an equivalent valuation. That's exactly what's going on in this picture. So beta is lower than 1 over 1 plus R. And therefore, the slope of that line, even assuming a constant wage differential forever, is going to be flatter. So the intersection is no longer there, but it's there. Okay, so that means that a larger wage differential is necessary to motivate people to leave. Okay, so again, remember the simple Edgeworth analysis said that the wages would basically continue to induce migration until the wages are exactly equal. Well, that's not what's happening in this picture. This picture implies that maybe the Edgeworth analysis is a little bit too extreme in the sharp prediction it generates. Polish wages may never really be exactly equal to the German ones, but there won't be any incentives for the Poles to migrate to Finland or to Germany at some point because it just doesn't pay. People are the word in German, bodenständig, right? They like where they come from. They like their soccer team. They like their local neighborhood. They like the local beer. Okay, this is true of French people also. It's not just Germans. It's not just Poles. So this is what makes Europe kind of different from the United States, if you like. But this is not the end of the story, because this assumption in the background that we made is that this wage differential lasts forever. So what if I change the framework and say this is the current wage differential, but I'm going to assume that the wage differential is shrinking for the same reasons that we've discussed in the Edgeworth analysis, which says as capital intensity in the receiving region falls, it becomes less attractive. So the wage falls with the falling capital intensity in Finland in this case. And it starts to rise. It starts to rise in Poland. And as it does so, this benefit of migration, WF minus WH, actually shrinks at a rate. So suppose it shrinks at rate alpha, at rate lambda. So suppose it shrinks at this little rate lambda, then we have to, in effect, discount it also by that rate of shrinkage. Every period, it gets a little bit smaller. And you know the rule with shrinkage, right? So it's if the Polish-German wage differential is shrinking at 5% per year, how many years does it take for it to fall by 50%? Good. Okay, so you learned it. Hope everybody else heard that. Okay, it's going to be on the exam. Right? So this is another reason to expect that what you observe today is not going to last forever. The model predicts wage convergence. Maybe not perfect convergence, but believe me, if you compare Germany with France over the past 30 years, wages are pretty similar. Germany and France have a similar level of economic development. Labor productivity is similar across, Germany's a little bit better off these days, but, maybe 20 years ago it was the other way around. So these are regions of similar economic development. Poland, other parts of Eastern Europe, after the accession, have a lot of catching up to do. So there's a general trend to expect, but it's not going to last forever. Okay? So, here's another important aspect that we haven't talked about, which is that there may be other aspects involved that make people resist migration. Resist it for all sorts of political reasons, but also for economic reasons. So under neoclassical assumptions, the migration will eventually remove the efficiency. I mean, we should all be happy about that. In a sense, GDP rises unambiguously for the sum of the two regions always. I'm going to show you that formally. I'm going to show you that diagrammatically. You can also show it formally in a simple application of the GDP formula. GDP rises. The only problem is it doesn't rise equally for everyone in both regions. So we have to look very carefully at the distribution of the change in GDP as the consequence of migration. Let me first show you that the migration episode that followed European integration has actually led to some convergence. Okay, so the model in its fundamental prediction was correct. Okay, so this is taken from the survey of earnings. I was unable to get the 2014 version because you actually have to pay for it. But I was able to get something else. So this is a 2010, just to give you a slow motion comparison. So you see that within 5 years, Bulgarian wages moved from 5 to 7% of German levels. That's quite a change if you think about it. Think about the absolute change of wages in Bulgaria. Coming from a very low level, the growth rate is significant. Okay? Similarly, in Croatia, put 8 divided by 22 is a pretty hefty rate of growth for 5 years. And look at Poland, 16 to 21. It's not as much. Poland's a bigger country. It's harder to move lots of people, harder to get possibly, it always depends on the alternatives. You remember Polish workers could not migrate to Germany immediately after the accession. There was a period of 8 years where Poles were not allowed to freely move to Germany after the Polish accession. But in the meantime, that's changed. You'll see that in a second. You can see there's a huge progress if you do the Eastern European comparison after 5 years. Okay, so this is a mixture, of course, of human capital mobility, labor mobility towards the West, but also capital mobility inward, and other factors that we'll talk about. Okay, so here's an update, 2012, not quite the same measure, but the rate of change is pretty indicative. So in 2 years afterwards, we have another significant movement of Bulgarian labor costs, or wages, if you like, for all practical purposes. There's been some change. Romania went down because of probably depreciation of their currency. But in general, the tendency has been towards more convergence. It's interesting to compare those differentials with other parts of Western Europe, because there's, first off, it's nice to know that Germany is not on the top of the heap all the time. In fact, there are lots of incentives for German workers to migrate to Switzerland or to Scandinavia. You can see that. At the same time, there are places in Western Europe that are actually doing much worse off. I mean, surprisingly, the UK is only at 70% of German earnings levels. So there are lots of incentives for people to move within old Europe, obviously aren't triggering lots of movement of people. So these fixed costs that we've talked about must be indeed quite significant. And that's something to keep in mind. But as you can see, there's still quite a bit of convergence to go. And you see this obviously in the capital labor ratios of these countries. They're still not very close to Western European standards. And the reason for that is because it's very, very expensive to move capital. It's very expensive to move people. And this will take time. Okay, I've mentioned already that the distribution of gains is not uniform. So when people migrate, you can show that GDP should increase for the union of those two regions. Okay, but you think hard about it. If a person leaves Poland, ceteris paribus, Polish GDP should go down. Okay, that person leaving is a production factor, moves to Finland, Finnish GDP should go up. Okay, so the Poles should be sorry that they're losing these people because their GDP is going down. But it turns out that you can show that the sum of the changes is still positive. So in some sense, the people in Finland could tax the gain in GDP to a little bit, to a small extent, and just transfer that money to Poland and compensate them for the loss. And everyone would be better off. It's a Pareto improving activity. Migration is a Pareto improvement over the original condition. Okay? It's kind of hard for people to get their minds around. Assuming no fixed costs of migration. If you do have fixed costs, then you have to net those out. And if you have other externalities, might be externalities. So one always has to condition these. But if there are externalities and if there are actually costs of migration, that would make it even less attractive. Okay, make it even more difficult to compensate the losers. So in some sense, it's interesting to think of this optimistic case. Okay. Now, of course, you're saying, well, why would Poland let these people go? Well, it certainly raises wages at home, makes firms a little bit upset, and they're kind of short on workers. So what would they do? They would probably, what would they do? Depends on the capital labor ratio and the productivity of capital. But it's a good chance that if those Polish firms represent an opportunity for the outside world, there might be a reason to invest in Poland. Okay, so it's a race between capital and labor, and capital will not just come from rich Finland; it will come from outside the EU, and that will also tend to raise GDP. Okay, so again, it's not a completely closed system. We have to ask what else is going on in the world. But again, just thinking about the movement of one person from Poland to Finland, that has clearly a non-neutral effect on the GDP of the two regions. Okay, but will also have an effect on the incentive to invest. So we can show this using a diagram. This is a classic diagram. It's actually in the textbook, so you can use this. Think of an economy where there's basically full employment, but there are two different wages. Workers in Finland would be earning W, and the Polish workers are earning W star. Okay, so so you can see there's a huge incentive to migrate, and in doing so, we would push the economy towards Q prime, the intersection of the marginal product of labor curves in both regions. So this may not look familiar to you. Think of the home diagram with the zero as being the labor demand curve, the marginal product of labor at home, and MPL star is the foreign wage. Okay, so that would be just would be the foreign marginal product of labor, and by flipping it, you can add the two allocations of labor and let them exhaust the total amount of labor in the sum of the two regions. Okay, so L plus L star would be the labor allotment to Poland and Finland together. Okay, so at the initial condition, if you like, this is the wage in Finland, this is the wage in Poland, W star is the wage in Poland, so there's huge incentives to migrate, but migration is simply moving from point L to point L prime from the Finnish situation, the in-migration, and the Polish situation would be losing labor moving from L to L prime. From their perspective, it would be a drop, okay? It would be a drop moving to this point would be the remaining Polish labor force in Poland. So think about this. This is not the same thing as the Edgeworth analysis. This is putting a marginal product curve on top of the allocation of labor. Implicit in the position of the labor demand curves, or the marginal product of labor curves, is the capital allocation in both. Okay, so the capital mobility would cause these curves to shift on top of what we're talking about. So this is holding capital constant, holding technology constant. Think about that. Please understand that, because it's a very important point. The whole point of using the Edgeworth analysis, the Edgeworth box, is that you have both production factors moving at the same time. Here, we're focusing really on labor. The reason I'm showing you this is because you can actually identify the gains from migration and the losses from migration. So this is the beauty of this particular diagram as compared with the one that we've used up until now. This is simply this is a dual demand diagram with a fixed supply, a fixed total supply of labor. Okay, but you still get some interesting insights, right? So first, the post-migration situation is clear. We're going to go from Q to Q prime. Okay, so, and if we assume that firms are always on their labor demand curves, if firms are on their marginal product of labor schedules, then the convergence will be such that wages will fall monotonically in the rich region, in the capital-rich region, or the high-wage region, i.e. Finland, and they will rise in the low-wage region. Okay? And as they do so, we can compare the new situation, Q prime, and ask, where did the gains go? And this is really important. I mean, this is going to explain why people resist migration. You know, not just because they're xenophobic, but because they actually may lose in economic terms. People feel threatened by migration. They feel like their jobs may be threatened. There's a way of understanding that, okay? And we're going to try to do that. So, area A is the loss of the home workers. So the Finnish workers are going to see their wages fall. And if you don't like thinking about Finland, think of Germany or France. The receiving country of the migration is going to see their wage fall. And you can think of this box as being the loss, the monetary loss of those guys, because they were earning W, and after the migration episode, they're earning W prime. Okay, so think hard about translating that into situations that you understand from your home countries. Okay? Now, the gain to the capital owners, on the other hand, is substantial. So the winners of in the Finnish context, the Finnish winners, the winners in Finland, are the owners of the firms that employ the migrants or employ more workers. And their gain is not just the new migrants, but it's the fact that wages are now W prime instead of W. So the surplus to the producers from this change in wages is A plus B, the sum of those two regions. Okay, so obviously the firm owners in Finland win because they can employ labor at a lower wage. Now, part of that you can think of as an efficiency gain. We call that producer surplus. That would be the triangle B, because A is just a transfer, if you like. It's the win for the capitalists, the loss for the workers. Right? So B is a gain for society. It's the elimination of deadweight loss that was around because we couldn't use labor more efficiently. Remember, the first definition of economic integration is the efficient use of resources made possible by the union of regions. That's exactly what's happening right here. Okay, so B is a gain for society. A plus B is the gain to the capitalists, to the employers, and A is the loss of the home workers. Okay, you can do the whole analysis looking from the foreign perspective. This is probably harder for you to understand, but the foreigners gain by not moving. Okay, so the Polish workers that decide not to leave benefit from the higher wage that results from the exit of their friends to Finland. Okay, and that's area F. Okay? Similarly, the Polish employers have lost because they have to pay higher wages. Okay, the employers of capital lose. On the other hand, you can think of D as kind of as part of their loss, but it may be compensated in other ways. It may be compensated by the fact that we're moving to point Q prime. And that's the gain of the migrant workers. Okay, so the loss to the Polish firms is kind of picked up by the workers in terms of a gain, and then there's also some deadweight loss that's eliminated because of the transfer of workers to a more productive setting. Okay, so the foreign and home gains basically can be written down in that way. It's B plus C. And how you redistribute those gains is a big question. We know that the capitalists lose in the sending country where the migration is being sent, and they win in the receiving country. And then there's this question as to whether it makes sense or is possible for society to reorganize its maybe tax system to try to capture some of those gains and give it to the losers to make them in favor of this change, because there are serious losers in this process, right? The workers in Finland and the capitalists in Poland do lose, and even if it's a transfer, still a loss. Again, the gain of the foreign workers staying in Poland would be F plus D, and then you have, of course, the gain of efficiency that's brought about because of the migration in point C. Okay, this is the easiest way to understand this. Okay, that's kind of interesting to look at those different, in a sort of a competitive setting. But if you look at migration in general, this is a very general point. Anytime you have migration, the labor supply curve is shifting to the right. So as long as you have market clearing, moving from point B to point D will always imply an increase in GDP for the receiving region. I made that point already. It means that there's available GDP around there that we could probably tax and transfer, even though there's some losses. The workers lose. Here you can see that if you look at the case, these new migrants will be earning the new wage. They're getting certainly a big gain because they were earning in their old country before. Now they can get this higher wage. The existing workers lose from seeing their wage fall from W to W prime. There's still available surplus that can be taxed and transferred. This is not the case if we have unemployment. Okay, so one important proviso or restriction to what I just said is that if you have a situation where the markets aren't clearing, then migration, people coming for no particular gain, they may actually get a job, they may not, but they will create unemployment, okay, because the wage isn't allowed to fall. And that's a really important point. In this another diagram we had market clearing. The wage was allowed to allocate workers to their best alternative uses. Okay, in this case, if you have some sort of rigidity, minimum wages, for example, or maybe recalcitrant unions, or some employee bargaining situation that doesn't adjust to market realities, then you're going to have this type of situation where you have unemployment. So unemployment actually increases after immigration. Now, a lot of people connect migration with unemployment. There's no really strong evidence that's always the case, but one has to be aware that if wages don't adjust, there will be some possibility of increased unemployment after migration. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about something that's somewhat different. I'm going to talk about the invisible aspects of migration on the target region. Okay, so this is often called opportunistic migration policy. So if you look at places like Canada and Australia and the United States, it is relatively easy to migrate to these countries if you have the right credentials, if you have a good education, if you have a skill. Okay, it's fairly easy to get a green card compared to if you're just a simple worker, okay, or you have no skills at all. Europe, on the other hand, doesn't hasn't yet really endorsed this type of migration policy, and it's very difficult to get into Europe, as we've seen from recent events. But and when you do, the best approach is just to apply for asylum. Okay, it seems to be unfortunately, it doesn't involve work or putting people to work or actually improving efficiency. But in any case, those people who tend to make it, even under the best of circumstances or the worst of circumstances, tend to be different from those people who don't migrate. One reason might be just because they have a different expectation of their future earnings. Okay, that was part of our theory. So people who have a very, also young people tend to have long expected future lifetimes. They tend to amortize investments over longer periods, and therefore a smaller wage differential is more likely to motivate them to migrate than it would for a person who's older and maybe doesn't have that much time left to work, because the wage differential is only useful if you can actually profit from it. Okay. This is a more subtle point. This says that people are different in ways that we cannot observe. People have different personalities, they have different motivation, they have different willingness to work hard in the receiving region. And this needs to be looked at, okay? Because in addition, you need to look at, and we'll come to it in a second, you need to also remember that when migration comes, it also creates external effects. Okay, migrants may need schools, they may need hospitals, you may need more infrastructure because cities tend to be clogged up. And if you need to raise money to pay for that, you have to raise taxes. Okay, so there are all sorts of implicit problems involved and the like. Okay, but I'm going to focus on this aspect, which is the unobservability of those things that motivate people to migrate. Okay, so this is called the Roy model, and I've never taught this before. Okay, so you might want to pay attention. This is about, it's not exactly true, I've never taught it in a bachelor's course. This is about a model. Roy thought about the decision to become a fisherman or a hunter, you know, and the question is, why do you do that? The idea is simply you do what you're best at doing. You think hard about what you can do and your skills and the way you apply them. So when we observe people who become fishermen and hunters, they're not necessarily going to be randomly selected. So the people that we observe who migrate to Germany from Morocco or from the United States or from Russia will not be a simple random draw from the population. And it's not clear whether those people are going to be better than average or worse than average of the domestic population. You have to think about it in a statistical sense. Okay, so the central assumption that the Roy model makes is that workers are different, and they're different in ways that we do not and cannot observe. Okay, so that just means that an econometrician who has data on workers will never be able to know exactly what makes these workers tick or what they can do. We know that the workers are doing the best they can. Otherwise, what's the point of doing economics? The reason you migrate is to better your condition, because you think you can do better somewhere else. And it's very costly. We've already understood that. Changing your residence is usually it's quite a serious decision. Okay, so you're going to make those decisions. You're going to take those decisions based on the expected gains. And if you think about the wage as a random variable in the target region, then it's easy to understand what matters for this decision. So it means if I migrate to another country, I have to think of where I'm going to land in the distribution of wages. So the mean might be high in Germany for a person coming from Africa, but do they know where they're going to land in the distribution? Are they going to be in the high part of the distribution, or are they going to be in the low part? And if the low part is very low, then it may not make sense for them in expected terms. Okay, so I'm going to write this down statistically. But what matters then is not just the mean, and you all have taken statistics. What matters is the variance of both distributions, and it also matters what the covariance is between the two draws. So if I have a high wage here, does it mean that I'm going to get a high wage in France if I move to France? Well, probably, but not necessarily. Maybe I'm in a system that's repressed, and maybe my occupation doesn't earn much because, well, teachers don't get paid very well, but if I move to France, teachers get paid a lot more. That would make it very interesting for me, depending on where I am in the distribution. But generally, these things are correlated. So what's going to be most important are the variances. Okay, so think of these as the two distributions. So mu-s is the mean of the sending region, and mu-t is the target region. Okay, so all I know is where I am right now, and we don't even know that. We observe this person deciding to leave. Maybe we don't even have information on that person's wage, but we know that they're coming from this distribution somewhere. The question is, what do they think of? They think of, well, suppose I'm here. You know, if I'm unlucky, I might land here. I might land in this lousy part of the receiving country's distribution. That wouldn't make it very interesting to migrate. So if the target region wage is ex ante, the variance of the wage in the target country is also important. Okay? So obviously if the target region has a very, very tight variance, it's going to have a different implication if it has a wide variance relative to what I am. Also, this is going to matter is what the correlation is. If I'm at the top of the heap in the home country and I move, and the correlation of wages in the two distributions is high, then I'm going to be in the top of the heap in the receiving country too. If I'm a doctor and I'm leaving some African country and I come to Germany and my training is recognized, I'm going to have a pretty good occupation. I'm going to have a good wage when I get there. So we can actually use correlations to understand that decision. So suppose you earn WS in the source region and you don't know what you're going to get. You earn WT in the receiving region. It may not be a good idea to do the migration after the fact. Once I'm there, I may regret it, so I better do a good job thinking about it. And I'll basically care about that correlation. We're going to call that rho, just like in statistics, rho PS. Okay? And this is the formula that would be implied if I have a joint normal distribution of wages at home and wages abroad. Think of this as the optimal linear predictor. If I know what my wage is here, that's WS, my expected value of the wage in the receiving region is equal to the mean of the receiving region plus the deviation of my wage from my own mean at home times the correlation with the receiving region. Okay, so if you think about this, this looks a little bit like a regression parameter. Those of you who took statistics remember that the beta in the regression formula is simply the covariance divided by the variance. That falls out of this normal assumption. And if you use the fact that the correlation is just the covariance divided by there should be a square root here. No, that's right, that is the square root. The product of the two standard deviations, and you can rewrite this formula as the red one. You can see basically what matters is the correlation of my earnings home and abroad, the variance of the earnings abroad. So everything equal, I'd like to go to a region where there's a big spread. So that means that if I'm lucky, I'm really going to do well, holding everything else constant. However, if the variance at home is high, then it's going to make me a little bit less interested in migrating. So this is kind of a variation of the so-called Roy approach to understanding. So to understanding migration. So this is the gain from migration. You think of this minus what you're earning. And basically this is a function of what I'm earning, but it's also a function of what this is going to translate into when I get to the receiving country. Okay, so these are the predictions. You know, if I'm productive in the home country, I'm likely to be productive in the receiving country. If the correlation is positive, I'm going to go. Other things given. If the concentration of the source region wages is lower, I'm going to be more interested in going because the implied gain will be higher. The increase in the variability of the target wage is also going to be interesting for me. This is why there's so much migration to the United States, because the variation of wages are so high. If you're really good at what you do and you go to the United States, you can really make a lot of money. Okay? Less interesting to go to a place where the distribution of income is fairly tight, like Sweden, because no matter how good you are, no matter how productive you are, you're still going to be making a very comparable salary. Okay? And of course, it's obviously related to the correlation. So the correlation has to be positive. If it's negative, you could think of the old system of central planning. If you were coming from a central planned economy and you were teaching Marxism, Leninism, and you had a high salary at home, you probably wouldn't get a very high salary in the receiving country. But otherwise, it's pretty fair to associate this number with a positive number. So if you migrate, you're going to get a comparable position in the wage distribution where you lived before. So this is a very interesting model to understand the implications of migration, because it also means that unobservable aspects can be an attractor to countries that have large variances, or they're sitting very much higher in terms of the distribution, in terms of the mean. Therefore, countries like Germany will benefit from the quality of the migrants as well as the quantity. Okay, so these are effects that we don't really know exactly how to quantify. It's difficult to do so, but there have been some very interesting attempts to do so in the American context. So a lot of times we know that certain groups, because of discrimination or because of gender, have been restricted in their access to certain parts of productive activity. It's interesting to ask, for example, what is the cost to Germany of not letting women participate for so many years? Germany has a fairly lousy history of female participation in the labor force compared to Sweden. And the question is, okay, so what is the cost of that? Or what is the cost of keeping women in occupations where they're sort of female occupations, not letting them get into a Vorstand and be a manager? What is the cost of that? Okay, these costs can be quite significant. So this is the same thing. The Roy model would predict that people who have talent would move into those areas where the talent can be translated into high wages, and you can think of migration as a simple application of that. Okay, the final aspect of the theory, before I start talking about the applications, is that a lot of people think about migration, but they don't do it. So this is a very interesting survey that was conducted 15 years ago. In the wake of the decision of the European Union, the start of the Copenhagen process to start allowing countries to join, people were really scared. They thought all of Albania would just move to Germany, right? It's a small country, but think about it. Greece, Albania, Bulgaria. I mean, Greece has been around for a long time, and all those Greeks haven't come to Germany, so there must be something wrong with the theory. So the idea was to start talking to people in these countries, do a survey, and ask them, have you thought about going to Germany? Have you thought about going to France? And if so, have you been there already? Have you done it? Okay? And the answer is pretty interesting. So the reason I keep putting this slide in the lecture is it shows that a lot of people think about it. A lot of people have considered it. Very few people have actually done it. So it indicates, again, the costs are high. And there may be some option value of not doing the migration immediately, some option value of postponing the decision into the future. Okay? So this is a follow-up question on do you think you might migrate? Okay, so look at the poorest country in this sample was Albania. Okay? So 38% of people said they were going to migrate to the West, and this is mostly Italy and Greece. This is not Germany, but it's still worth thinking about, right? Small country. But all the other countries are pretty insignificant. The reason why is Albania had a huge gap in terms of GDP and wages compared to any of these other countries that were, and there were some large ones. But if you look at the correlation, it's pretty close to the differences in GDP per capita across those countries, especially if you look at the definite plus maybe as an answer. So the last theoretical construct I'd like to present is a modification of the decision theory of the investment problem that we associate with the investment problem, which says basically that this initial analysis may not be quite correct. There may be some value of having the migration option and still not executing it or actually using it. Okay, so it's like saying, I give you, what is it worth to you to have the ability to migrate in case you decide to do so, but you don't have to do it right now. So you have this option. It's like a stock option. You have the right to purchase a stock at a certain price, but you don't have to. You can think in terms of the migration decision the same way. But no longer do we concentrate on this line. We have to think a little bit harder about it, because basically, if you migrate, you cannot reverse the decision. You can reverse migrate, but you've already paid the fixed costs. So once you decide to migrate, you have to pay F, and that's it. You never get F back. So it may be sensible to wait and see. And if it's sensible to wait and see, you know, why would you want to wait and see? You might wait and see because you think things might get better. They might get better in a random way, not just in a deterministic way like the Edgeworth analysis implies, but it's sort of there may be just a good shock. Maybe Poland will have a huge tourism boom and wages will start rising, you know, in a way we didn't anticipate. And if that could happen, and you're sitting in Britain, you may resent or regret that. You may regret the fact that you migrated because you missed out on this great chance. Okay? So this red line is supposed to depict the option value of the migration decision. And you can see that this intersection point is basically where I would do the decision no longer this point or anywhere here. Because basically, if I migrate, I've executed the option, and I can't go back and, you know, say, well, maybe I'd like to stay after all. Okay, so it's the finality of that decision. Of course, migrate, you can always reverse migrate. We know people do that, okay, but you have to pay again to come back. Right? So this is the so-called option value of real decisions, which associated with Dixit and Pindyke, an old book that's been used in many different applications for decision making under uncertainty. Okay, so it's a very important point. It's a modification, yet another modification, another reason to think that the threshold is much higher than just, you know, the simple model, the value the simple model would imply. And as a result, you can think of this, you know, if you're just a hardline finance guy, you'd think this is the decision point. You have this region where people don't migrate, even though you think they should. And that's because there's this value to procrastinate. There's a value for postponing the decision. And that's this region that we observe here. So this can explain why, you know, we don't have the entire Albanian population in Italy right now, because it's a costly decision, and things are getting better in Albania. Albania has a booming tourism industry. Okay. So that's the comparison you want to make. All right, so in the last 15 minutes, I want to give you some examples of labor mobility in practice. I'm going to take you through several instances in the past, in the European experience and the United States, actually, to show you how these principles apply and can be used profitably. I'll talk about East-West Germany in more detail. I'll talk about the U.S. Situation, migration within states. About 3% of Americans are mobile every year. It's a little bit less than it was 10 years ago, but it's still pretty high compared to Europe. Mobile means changing state of residence. Okay, that's quite a bit. There's a lot of EU migration that's been observed. I'm not talking about people trying to get into Europe. I'm talking about people who are already in Europe moving around. Some of those people may be from other countries. Some of them may be from countries where they weren't born. So you'll see in a second, construction workers moved from Romania to Spain, and a lot of them stayed there, but a lot of them have moved since back to Romania or to some other place in Europe to be construction workers. So these people tend to have highly mobile profiles. So think of the East-West German migration as sort of a great example of how intense it can be. The wall comes down. We have a wage differential that's huge, 75%, 80% wage gap at the outset. More than 1 million people actually moved residence in the first 2-3 years. A lot of people. A lot of people came back, didn't like it. Okay, so there's obviously an issue about maybe this is not for me. We found that wages are an important driver. So relative wages were very high in the West. East German workers were incentivized to go. Young people migrated the most, older people didn't. And these effects were also somehow attenuated or increased by the unemployment rate in the region. So those states in East Germany that had relatively high unemployment saw a lot more people leaving. Okay, we'll show that in a second. This is just to give you a picture of how much the migration episode was. So on the left-hand side, you've got migration. This is thousands of workers flow per year. And this is starting in the late 1950s and going to the end of the 1990s. So those of you from East Germany know about this part, but a lot of you may not know about this part. This is the flood of East Germans into West Germany because of fear of a wall, or fear of the communist regime, basically. This is the reason they built the wall in the end. Okay? And this period represents the period that the wall was in place and preventing people from moving. Okay? So the movements before the wall was built were comparable to those when the wall fell. And you can see what's even more interesting is that even in these times, there was significant reverse migration or migration in the other direction. So people were either fleeing capitalism because they had some girlfriend or boyfriend in the East, which has actually has happened. A lot of people migrated right after the wall came down and decided, hey, this isn't for me. I miss Thuringia. I miss FC Union. I want to come back and be in the East again. Okay, so this is what we observed. And what's happening now, this is kind of, if you extend this to the current period, net migration is now 0. There's very little net migration between East and West Germany. But at the same time, these flows are quite large still. So there's still people leaving, but there are a lot of people coming back. This is a plot of the shorter episodes since the wall came down. So you can see that about 22% of the German population was actually in East Germany, 22.5%, and about 22% of the employed labor force was in the East. And that's fallen to just over 18.5% and just over 20% respectively. That's quite a shift of population. That is costly, right? Even if a lot of those costs are borne by private individuals and not by the public sector, it's still costly. Maybe we could have avoided that by doing other things. We understand that from the Edgeworth box analysis. Capital mobility could have offset that. Okay, so here's the Edgeworth analysis, or the Edgeworth box for Eastern German states. So each one of those dots represents a state. So MPV is Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Thuringia, Brandenburg, Sachsen-Anhalt, Berlin, Saxony, and this is the average of all of West Germany. Okay, so you can see, obviously, there are more people in West Germany. Over time, they've increased their capital intensity, so the slope of that line has been increasing over time. But you also see that the East German economy, the East German states, the East German economy in general, has been catching up. Okay, there's no question, in terms of the intensity of production, of capital intensity, there has been significant catch-up. Capital intensity of workers in place, not necessarily population. Now, I've done some econometrics on this, so you can actually estimate the effects of wage changes on migration. You can see that wages in the target region have a positive effect, a pull effect on migration, and a wage increase in the source region has the reverse of a push effect. So, and they're different. Okay? You can also see that the effect of unemployment is rather small. It's insignificant in the source region, but in the target region it's important. So the East Germans tended to migrate to those regions where unemployment was low, sensibly enough, right? Because we don't have a guarantee of finding a job. You want to go to places where there are lots of open positions. This is the most interesting finding, is that migration is highly sensitive to age. Okay? Maybe obvious to most of you, but you really see that in the East German data. The flows of people responding to the migration opening in the early 1990s are strongest for young people. So people just under 25 years old, very, very high elasticity of the wage differential. Okay? Now, if you go to the United States and take similar episodes, you find nothing like that. You can think of the United States development as being one big mobility run, but there are a lot of similarities to the German case. Lots of young people are involved. People migrate early in the life, usually between 18 and 22. A lot of that involves going to college, but also looking for a better lifestyle and the rest. We can see that even in the United States, migration still follows the money. Okay, so this is a function, this is basically the Barrow diagram that I showed you 2 weeks ago, plotting migration rate for each state as a function or in relation to the 1990 per capita income. So those states that had high per capita incomes tended to get more people coming in, with some exceptions. One exception is Florida, because of the nice weather, because of air conditioning. Arizona, California, Nevada, very nice places, so they get more than the expected amount of migration. But if you eliminate those states, you see that it follows pretty much a tight linear relationship. The European Union has got a lot of migration. In terms of the numbers, it's not quite as spectacular as the United States, but one thing we have noticed is that Europe was an emigration source. It was a source of people leaving to go to the United States, to Australia, to Latin America, up until the 1950s, as a function not just of World War II and World War I, but in general, migrating to places where wages are higher. Think of the Roy model, think of the distribution of income in the United States. Because it is so broad, it provides an opportunity for a lot of people to go there and make lots of money. Okay? But you can see this has changed. Europe is now becoming a target for immigration. This is not just something we've observed in the past few months. This is a long-standing issue. When the wall was up, it involved migration from Eastern Europe. Now it involves mostly migration, or the controversial part involves migration from outside of Europe. Okay, and there's a big discussion as to what kind of policy should be invoked. A lot of the arguments we've used already for internal migration can be used. You have these problems of economic integration, but you also have problems of social and political integration as well. This is a nice picture that Eurostat provides that just shows you this is a very interesting year. This is 2006. This is before the financial crisis, which reversed a lot of these flows. This just shows the internal European balance of migration. These are huge numbers if you look at it. I mean, look at the number of people that moved from Romania to Spain in 2006, which is just before the Spanish real estate market crashed. 108,000 people. And at the same time, you have the Polish emigration to Great Britain, but also to Germany. So already in 2006, before the terms of the grandfather clause between Poland and Germany were relaxed, there's still quite a large population of people moving. So these are the kind of flows that we're talking about. These are not insignificant. Okay, so here's some facts. The most important thing you should think about is that people don't migrate as much as we'd expect them to. Okay, so one of the fascinating things, and I've been trying to modify the theory in different ways to show you why people don't migrate. The mystery is why people don't migrate as much as we think they should. Why are they actually kind of staying back? And this work that I referred to with Professor Hunt about Germany also showed, some of her work has showed actually, that if you just take econometrics and you estimate the tendency of West Germans to migrate and you apply it to East Germany, you really overpredict the amount of migration that should occur. So there's really sort of a, call it what you want, Bodenständigkeit, preferences for local amenities. People like where they are. This is kind of what Europe is about. Europe is about people who didn't migrate to the United States or Australia or Canada. The people that stayed, maybe they have just a different genetic makeup and they like hanging out and not running away to make a higher buck. Okay, so here's some numbers to back up those statements I just made. The changes in migration have been significant, but they have not been uniform, and they seem to reflect in a lot of ways, not just the economics of East and West or rich and poor Europe, but also idiosyncratic aspects. So Germany didn't receive very much migration after unification for one reason, because unemployment rose in Germany. So in the late 1990s, Germany was kind of a sick man, high unemployment rate, firms were having problems. This turned to be a deterrent to migration compared to a place like Ireland or parts of Southern Europe like Spain. Okay, I'm done. I hope you enjoyed that. Next lecture, we're going to talk about trade. Okay, so again, we've talked about capital accumulation, the solo model. We've talked about capital mobility within regions. We've talked about labor mobility. Those are all substitutes for each other in terms of making regions more efficient, more convergent. But we still haven't talked about trade. Okay? So economic trade, trade in goods and services, can be yet another substitute for the forces we've talked about. Okay, so this means that if Poland and Finland, instead of moving people or machines, they can actually just specialize in goods that use their comparative advantage or the factors that they have more abundancy in. Okay, so this is one version of 3, possibly 4 different theories of trade that can be used to explain European integration. Again, it's another way of thinking about how Germany and Poland, how Poland and Finland, and even outside of the European Union, this process of increased efficiency takes place. So we're going to introduce you to some trade theories. I'm not going to give you a course in trade. Some of you have taken Professor Kamika's course, which will be helpful, but you won't need that to understand. The idea is how these different production factor endowments can be translated into economic advantage without moving the factors. Okay? And therefore, we'll spend some time thinking about the theory of capital and labor in a theory of trade, when you have several goods, not just one good like we have now, but several goods. In case you're interested, we'll talk about 2 goods to get started. Okay, thanks for your attention.